Great. Well, welcome everyone to today's meet and greet with Matt Haney. As you know, we'll be recording this event. If you don't want to be recorded, you can turn off your video and reset your name to anonymous. So just to reiterate a few words about our host organizations, as I mentioned, I'm Zach Subin, a volunteer lead with Urban Environmentalists. Also co-hosting is Streets for People Bay Area. And our third host is SF YIMBY. And we are all three a part of the YIMBY Action Network. As you probably know, as Bobak just reviewed, we're having a special election for San Francisco's State Assembly District 17 this February. And this is the final meet and greet in the series with Supervisor Matt Haney. So I'll start off with a few questions and then we can move on to audience Q&A. So please be ready to use the Zoom raise hand feature or type your question when the time comes. So thank you very much for joining us, Supervisor. We're very glad to have you tonight. And rather than my introducing you, I was wondering if you could start off and tell us a little bit about yourself and why housing, transportation, and the urban environment matters to you.
Cool. Well, thank you so much, Zach, and thank you to all of you for being here and for your interest and your engagement. I'm looking forward to the conversation and answering any and all of your questions. Let's see. Just a little bit about myself. I'm born and raised here in the Bay Area. I was raised by a single mom in the East Bay. My family is from San Francisco. I moved a lot as a kid, but all sort of around the Bay Area. Lived in mostly apartment buildings. My mom was a renter, and we were moving around for much of my time as a kid. And I went to public schools. I went to a public university at UC Berkeley. I actually worked, my first job out of college was I worked at the state legislature. I was a state Senate fellow and legislative aide, and learned a lot from that experience, both about how important the work is that happens up there and how not everybody who we send to Sacramento is always accountable to the public or especially focused on actually legislating. I've spent the last 15 years working on progressive policy change, almost entirely in San Francisco. I ran the UC Student Association representing students across the state. I ran Cut 50, which is an organization focuses on criminal justice reform, or co-founded Cut 50. I've represented people pro bono as an eviction defense attorney. I worked for many years with Van Jones on various progressive policy issues. And for the last 9 years, I've served as an elected official here in San Francisco, 6 years on the Board of Education and 3 years on the Board of Supervisors, including as the budget chair. I represent District 6, which most of you are familiar with. I see some people here who are constituents in District 6. District 6 is probably the most urban of the districts in San Francisco, which I think is a good thing. I think I have maybe didn't initially self-identify this way, but now I would very much identify this way, which is that I do consider myself an urbanist, or a progressive urbanist for sure. I believe that having more people who live in cities, who are close to where they work, who can get around on public transit or biking or walking, who have all of the things that come with cities and what makes them great, including small businesses and arts and culture and nightlife. All of these things, I think, are things that actually make our lives better, that improve the overall quality of life, and also improve our environment. And so I really do appreciate the framing that you all have, which is that if we want to improve our environment, if we want to take on climate change, if we want to reduce our carbon footprint, we should increase urban environments and make density and people able to get around without vehicles a more accepted and common feature of our state's infrastructure and layout. So I've worked on those issues as a supervisor. We built a lot of housing in District 6. We've focused a lot on the features of urban living that I think enhance quality of life, whether that's 24-hour bathrooms or street cleaning or bike lanes, nightlife, arts and culture, public safety. And we've also, I think, focused a lot on people who are, in some cases, failed by our city, people who are experiencing homelessness or mental illness, behavioral health challenges, and trying to work to have adequate levels of shelter, navigation centers, and supportive housing. But with all of that, I think, as you would probably agree, it's not enough to just do it in District 6. And I see my old friend Sonia Traus on as well, and she's here and would always say we need affordable housing everywhere. I agree, absolutely. She was right about that, and she was right about a number of things, or is right about a number of things. The reality is that all of these issues that we're facing, whether it's questions of building enough housing, building enough supportive housing, building enough navigation centers, shelters, treatment beds, we need solutions at a bigger level than what can even be provided in District 6. We need every neighborhood and city to be building housing. We need every neighborhood and city to be building transportation infrastructure, bike, pedestrian infrastructure, so that people don't have to rely on cars. We need high-speed rail. We need much more aggressive approaches when it comes to addressing climate change. We need people to be able to live near where they work. And I think in District 6, we've demonstrated that we can do many of these things, and we are doing many of these things, and we actually could do more and could do better for sure. But we also need leadership across our city and across our state. And so that's what I hope to be able to bring. I think I've demonstrated my support for the principles of urbanism and want to be able to take that message to Sacramento and be able to deliver by building more housing, by building better transit infrastructure, by ensuring that people everywhere can live with dignity. That means, having healthcare, mental health care, living wage jobs, investments in public education and higher education everywhere in our state. So with that, Zach, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Matt. I think you mostly answered my next question, but
Okay.
if you want to add any kind of specific state legislative policy priorities on those issues, housing, transportation, and urban environmentalism that you might focus on.
As I said, I really do think that having greater density, is an environmental issue. It is important that we build housing near transportation, that we, address the real out of whack jobs housing ratio that we have in San Francisco and other parts of our state, that we address exclusionary and racist zoning that has prevented any type of housing, but especially affordable housing from being built. That means that we have to, move forward with some of the approaches that the state has taken, including ensuring that cities and counties are meeting their housing goals, and if not, that there's real consequences for that and accountability around that. We need to make sure that we actually see through some of these larger transportation projects. We have money that is now coming through from the federal government, and we should have no excuse to actually complete high-speed rail. And we have some larger, second BART tube, but things that I think will allow us to really accelerate the regional approach to transportation and statewide approach to public transportation. I think that every city and county should be accountable to provide services for people experiencing homelessness. That has to mean real commitments around navigation center or shelter beds, treatment beds. These are things that people shouldn't be able to say no to. And I think that we have a responsibility as a state to have collective responsibility to for a lot of these challenges. So those are some of the things that I would focus on.
Great. So final question before we turn to the audience. So the legislature is a tough place. How will you actually get things done? How will you build political coalitions to get some of those policy ideas actually passed?
Well, I think that in my experience, you need to have both an inside and an outside strategy. You need to work to build coalitions inside of the building, and that means understanding what people's interests are, what motivates them, what their concerns are. In this case, building coalitions with people who represent, in some cases, similar types of areas, urban areas, the Bay Area, a very strong and united Bay Area and in Northern California. Coalition is critical, and then building out from there. Outside of the building, I think that we need to have, public pressure. We need to build power for coalitions that are pushing for housing and services and collective responsibility to our challenges, pushing back on some of the overwhelming emphasis on automobile infrastructure in our state. And I think all of those things can happen, and you all are a part of that. You're helping to build that coalition across our state. I do think that we need to figure out how to work with some of the other sort of bases of power and coalitions, whether that's labor unions, other kind of equity-focused coalitions, tenant groups, tenant coalitions, and collectively building the power to put the pressure to move these policies forward. So, I do think that we're moving in that direction, but it requires people who can bring about change by not only working within the building, but also building power outside and building coalitions and building a narrative, in the media and otherwise to get people to move. And I think, for me, I've run some of those statewide advocacy organizations. I've pushed on things from the outside. I've led protest movements. I've done all of that. And I've also worked in my role here to try to create more transparency and demystify some of the policy making. A lot of times people who are in politics who have access to information, who are in those board chambers every day when the public is not, they hide information, and they're not transparent with what's actually going on and why people are doing what they're doing, or what is actually happening. And so for me, it's also engaging people, especially young people, with the political process and demystifying it and exposing some of the ways that people are excluded because they don't have access to information. And, in Sacramento, bills go to appropriations committee and they die, and people never know what happened, And I think there are a few people, unfortunately, in the state legislature who are telling the truth about why things are happening the way they are and calling out the people who are getting in the way. And I think that I'm not going to be afraid to do that.
All right, well, I've got a few more questions I could ask you, but looks like we've already got some audience questions coming up. And as a reminder, please either add your question in the chat and we'll read it for you, or you can raise your hand and then we will call on you to ask it. We'll try to go in the order received, but give everyone a chance to ask one question before coming back to folks. So first I'll go to Stuart Collins has a question in the chat. Building infrastructure projects like buildings and rail cost much more in California and the US compared to other countries. What would you be doing to implement state policies that reduce the cost of building infrastructure so that we can build more of it?
Well, you know, one of the reasons why I think that it costs more here is because of all the delays and all of the ways in which we create layer after layer of bureaucracy that prevents these things from moving quickly. You know, we've basically built into the system ways to, you know, stop at every turn funding and plans that the voters have approved. And so, you know, I think that we shouldn't allow these so many of these processes and so many of these laws that we put in place that essentially allow something as critically important to our environment as high-speed rail from happening. And it's all of the delays and all of the layers and layers of bureaucracy that create some of those costs. And so, you know, I know there was a recent New York Times podcast that analyzed this specific issue that I listened to, and I do think that they identified that we've really built in, you know, and I think that's true for a lot of areas of, you know, local input is important, but if you basically set up all these processes where by design, you know, things are not going to happen because of how many layers you have to go through, I think that's, you know, that's really part of what causes such a cost.
Yeah, we're also fans of that podcast. I think you're referring to Ezra Klein and Jerusalem does us.
Yes, I've that. Yes.
I think Will Frankel had his hand raised next. If our co-host could unmute him.
Thanks, Zach, and thanks to Supervisor Haney for joining us tonight. In 2019, you voted to, you joined onto a resolution opposing SB 50, which for my money probably would have been the single greatest leap towards housing affordability, maybe in the history of California's entire housing crisis. SB 50, or maybe something very similar to it, could be reintroduced during your potential time in the state assembly. How would you vote on that bill today? And if you're still opposed to it, what changes specifically would be necessary to earn your support?
Yeah, I'm definitely open to a bill similar to SB 50, and as I said, I do support building housing near transit, and I think that there are parts of that bill that at the time, particularly as it related to some of the equity portions, the more sensitive communities, how we thought about gentrification in some areas where I didn't feel like it was sort of fully where it needed to be. With that said, I definitely am open to a similar type of bill now and would engage actively in that. I obviously was not a legislator at the time. I was a newly elected supervisor, and to the extent that I understood what the bill would do, I felt like there were some things that still needed to be improved about it. But ultimately, for me, I am going to focus on getting more housing built in areas where historically it hasn't been built, particularly in suburbs, particularly in areas where there's been exclusionary zoning. I think that's an area that I'm very interested in. And so bills like SB 50, particularly, in the moment that we're in right now, I think we can do a lot more. And one of the things that we need to do for sure is state leadership as it relates to zoning. So I definitely would be open to it. I haven't seen a new version of that bill proposed now, but certainly would be open to some version of it and addressing some of those things that I mentioned. And I think that we can get there and get something similar done.
All right. Next, we're going to go to Edward Giordano's question in the chat. What are your thoughts on congestion pricing and other traffic calming measures?
You know, I've been very vocally and actively supportive of traffic calming measures here in my district and in the city. We in the Tenderloin are the first neighborhood in San Francisco to reduce our speed limit to 20 miles per hour. We need to be reducing our speed limit a lot more in more places. We've also have now no right turn on red. I've been very actively supportive of other traffic calming measures like reducing lanes, increasing two-way streets over one-way streets. I don't think that I think that not only in San Francisco, but around our state, we have a very heavy over-reliance on car infrastructure. I support eliminating parking minimums. I would support different policies to increase the parking fees, and our state often gets in the way of that. And I support congestion pricing. I think that for the future of our city and downtown core, we need to make it a bit harder to drive and a lot easier to do other things, and safer and more accessible to do other things that are better for our environment and better for the livability of our city. So I do support it. Obviously, we have a lot of work to do to get it right. But I visited London and Stockholm. I've seen what they're doing. I know what New York is doing. I even know, LA is doing some things. We're now falling behind in San Francisco, not moving forward. And for a little while, we were ahead. 10 years ago, we were talking about this before pretty much anyone else was in the country. Now San Francisco is participating in studies and surveys and such, but sooner rather than later, we're going to need to see some political will and some political courage to actually move it forward. And I definitely support it.
Yeah, we definitely need political courage to make a lot of these changes. Let's go next to Babak.
Thank you, Zach. Supervisor Haney, one of the proposals that's before you and your fellow colleagues at the Board of Supervisors are several competing different fourplex proposals. And as you may know, SFEMB and other affiliated groups support the one from Supervisor Mandelman, the one that doesn't have below market rate income requirements. And particularly, we caught some, I don't know, like friendly disagreement with our friend Supervisor Safai over his proposal because it involved subsidizing very, very, let's just say middle-class incomes. And Asha apparently, one of the reasons he did this is because he believes the market can't ever build housing for the middle class again, which is why we have to spend time and energy and money subsidizing, in his mind at least. I don't want to put words in his mouth too much, but he has said this on Twitter and other places. Do you believe the market can build housing for the middle class again and push down market rate rents? And if so, what would you introduce in the assembly to do that?
Well, I mean, I support both approaches in the sense that I think that, we do need to build more housing that is market rate housing. I do support that. And I do think that that is a part of how we make housing affordable to the middle class. I don't think we can be at a point right now where we should ever say, nor accept, nor do I think it's realistic to say that, the middle class will only ever be able to access housing if it's subsidized housing. I don't think that's true. And for that reason, there are proposals like Supervisor Mandelman's proposal that I'm the only co-sponsor on currently, where I support the straight up fourplex proposal, not adding any other requirements on it, because I don't think it's really, at least from what I've seen, feasible to do so. With all of that said, I do agree that we need at massive levels additional investments in subsidized housing, social housing. When we have inclusionary, I think in some cases it makes sense to include middle income housing in that. We're doing that in a number of projects in my district. And so including some of the subsidized housing as middle income housing is something I support. Greater investments in government owned social housing, however defined, or taking housing off of the sort of the question of, how it's what its level of, how its price is going to be set, and making sure it's set in an affordable level is something that I support. But that to me is a yes, and we need that, and we need more market rate housing. And I do think that market rate housing can be built at levels where it's affordable for the middle class. I'm sure I live in market rate housing currently. It's rent controlled housing. It's a 1-bedroom in the Tenderloin. And most of my neighbors I would characterize as middle or working class. They live in buildings like this. And so we do need more buildings like this. And I support that. And I think subsidized housing, including for middle class or middle income folks, may also make sense. But as I said, to what you described in the beginning, I support a fourplex proposal that doesn't set aside units as deed restricted. I don't think that for a fourplex that makes a lot of sense. I think for a fourplex, we get more by actually incentivizing people to make that investment to build a fourplex and get us 4 units rather than 1, and ultimately that creates more units, which I think does increase overall affordability.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right. Next, I will read a question from Sonia. Have you read the findings for 450 O'Farrell that you'll be voting on tomorrow? And do you agree with them? And in case you haven't read them, you can always read them in real time because the link is in the chat. But just kidding.
I haven't read them in full yet, so I can't speak to every piece of it. The 450 O'Farrell project, there was a prior version of that project, which I think that was a project that had very broad support and agreement and from the neighborhood, and I thought was a good project. It basically, piggybacked the approval and tried to tie it to an entirely new project, which I agreed was not a reasonable thing, and I wanted them to build the prior project. I know that there's disagreement, I'm sure, on that, but that's how I felt about that. So I haven't read the exact findings. I have read the Stevenson findings because I was especially interested in that, and do not support what they've put in that case.
All right. Next question from J. Connor Riddle.
Hello, I hope you remember me from Sacramento. As you can tell by my profile picture, I was able to spot you with the mask on. I have a question. So my wife and I walked down District 6 and we tagged down all the different empty buildings in District 6. And we were able to talk to many of the local businesses there, and they said it is super expensive to be in District 6, so they're leaving. So if all these businesses are leaving only tech jobs, then how are the middle class able to support themselves with a market rate housing with no job competition, because there'll be only tech jobs left?
Well, I think if I understand your question, and it's good to see you again. Great profile photo. We ran into each other in Sacramento a few weeks ago. I do think that we need to have investments in and support for a diverse set of economic and business opportunities. I've spent a lot of time, especially over the last few years, trying to support restaurants, our shared spaces program, our nightlife and culture investments, even in some cases protecting, industrial uses, PDR spaces. I do think that we need to make sure that there are a lot of different diverse economic uses in our city, and that they're affordable to people. Right now I've been very supportive of a commercial rent relief. We have many of our small businesses that are deeply in debt, and finding ways to support them to get out of debt, doing eviction protections for them, and then providing these other investments so that they can stay here is really critical. I mean, it's hard to do business here, and people, we don't have commercial rent control generally. And so if landlords are increasing rent right now, there's very little that we can do about it, but it is something that the state can take action on and allow for more tools for local governments and others to be able to implement. I'd like to see more support for small businesses. I'd like to see more flexibility so that they can do different things like we've done with shared spaces, so that they don't get overburdened by the regulations and the permitting and the bureaucracy, and that we're actually shifting to a more supportive posture towards our small businesses, and then doing all we can to help them address rent. But I supported Prop H, which was the ballot measure that the mayor put forward, trying to make it easier to get small businesses open. Together with Hillary Ronen, we authored something called First Year Free, where it's now free to open a small business, a retail business in San Francisco for the next year. That means no fees or any of that. That can save folks up to $20,000 or $30,000 that they would have had to spend to open a new business. So we have to make it cheaper. We have to make it easier. We have to support small businesses. We have to give the cities tools to address the skyrocketing in rent. We have to give flexibility in the zoning, and then the regular cost of quality of life things that help to create environments where people want to do business here.
Great. Next question I will read from John Bate. Do you think that the Board of Supervisors approval should be required for all housing project EIRs, which I believe stands for Environmental Impact Report? If not, what should the criteria be for whether a project EIR should require Board of Supervisor approval or not?
Should all EIRs come to the Board of Supervisors? Is that the question?
I think so. John, feel free to jump in if you want to clarify it.
Yeah, sure. So maybe we can take this to a specific example. You've had a couple of housing projects come up recently. One is a 450 off Farrell. The other was a 469 Stevenson. You voted to deny the EIR for 450 off Farrell, but you supported the Stevenson EIR. Please correct me if I'm mistaken, but I believe that's the case. So what was the reason for the differing votes on each one? And do you think the Board of Supervisor approval should be required for all housing projects that have an EIR? And if not, what should the criteria be?
So the 450 O'Farrell project was a CU. It was a conditional use. So it wasn't an EIR. The EIR, I did vote to deny the appeal and I guess uphold or support the EIR, depending on how you frame this, for Stevenson. I thought that the EIR was adequate, essentially. I do think that boards of supervisors, at least in our case for sure, spend too much time litigating these types of things, particularly EIRs. and everyone on the Board of Supervisors knows it. You know, I think that there are some things in local law, some things in state law that end up having it be that way. But I think we should have a more narrow set of approvals when it comes to CEQA that come to the Board of Supervisors. You know, I'd be willing to look at more closely at that as a legislator in terms of how to amend that. You know, even just in terms of time. I mean, you know, Stevenson got a lot of attention, but most of the EIRs that we spend time on at the Board of Supervisors are tiny projects. They're not good uses of our time at all. They are not something that an entire Board of Supervisors with as many complicated challenges and problems that we face should be spending 4 hours on, or whether you build 2 units or 3 units or 4 units and a bunch of neighbors think that they don't want that to happen, so they sue on it. Let alone, you know, we have CEQA challenges that relate to transportation, or, you know, things that are actually clearly good for the environment. So I think we spend too much time on these things. I don't exactly have a clear standard by which I would say right now which should come to the board and not, but I do think that there should be room for changes to the law.
Next question we'll take from Vanessa. What kind of policies would you support to help women or promote gender equality, such as policies to promote childcare affordability, childcare availability and affordability?
Yeah, I mean, we need much greater investments as a state in childcare. We've done some of those investments. Gavin Newsom's budget, you know, expanded, you know, to some of the funding and eligibility for childcare. We need to do a lot more of that. I think that childcare is essential. You know, it's something that and something that the state should provide for and fund. Same for really high quality early education. Same for, you know, paid family leave, maternity and paternity leave. All of these things, I think, require much greater support and investment from the state, and are a huge part of, as you said, you know, laws that are much more friendly and to support the needs and experiences of women in particular, but for families in general. You know, policies around equal pay and real accountability around that. You know, I think that one of the most important things we can do, particularly because women are overrepresented in, particularly women of color in the service sector, where workers are often exploited, underpaid, don't have adequate benefits. You know, having real accountability and oversight over industries like the fast food industry. There was a bill this year that would have done that. You know, finding ways to really uplift everyone in our state so that if you work a full-time job, you make a living wage that has health care, benefits like paid family leave, and then also an ability to retire with dignity. So I think all those things are things that are really about supporting women, particularly the overrepresentation of women in those industries, and then you know, much deeper investments in childcare and policies that families really rely on.
I'm gonna go to Stuart Collins' question next, because I don't believe Stuart's asked a question. So this is about kind of remote work and COVID. With respect to urban commercial health, businesses and offices in urban cores are slow to come back. Perhaps they won't come back to pre-pandemic normal, given remote work and online shopping. What do you see as the 10 to 20 year vision of what commercial cores could be in SF and elsewhere in California, and what state policies would be needed to adapt?
Well, you know, I think that cities at their best are places where people gather, where people, connect with each other, where there are creative uses, where people, want to be out and about. And, I think that particularly with remote work, some of the areas right now that are, zoned more for office space, need to be reconsidered for more active use, for housing, for transition to, I think, other types of uses that ensure that they're not, left empty and unused. I mean, right now, we have some of our office buildings where there's 30 floors, and 2/3 of those floors are unoccupied right now. So we don't know yet whether that will return, or in what capacity, or what work will look like. Will there be more co-working space? Whether there'll be other types of ways that people work. If the remote work that we're seeing now is made more permanent. But that aside, I think finding ways to transition to more active use, to entertainment uses, to co-working, to housing, to services, all of these things, I think, require not just changes in zoning, but potentially some level of support and investment from the state to help with those transitions. So it's not an easy question, because I think we're still in flux right now. I've thought a lot about this in my own district, but we don't really know to the degree to which the office work is going to come back, or remote work is going to continue. But having a bunch of vacant office buildings and a bunch of vacant retail is obviously not the solution. So we've got to make sure that we facilitate people's ability to do things that meet a need. And I think cities are always going to be able to offer something to not just their residents, but to visitors. And what that looks like has to be something that the state and the city are both actively facilitating, with investments, with zoning, with what we're building, with transportation, and all the things that make cities active, exciting, thriving places.
And just to check, Supervisor, since we started 5 or 10 minutes late, are you able to stay till about 8:35 or 8:40?
Sure, I will do my best. This is probably my 17th event of the day, so I'm doing my best to respond to the rapid fire, very tough questions. So I'm happy to stay. If my answers are becoming unintelligible, that's something that I will warn you about. But
we definitely appreciate that. So this question hopefully is not less hard. Simon Tan asks, where do you get your policy ideas? Can you name any books, podcasts, academic research, or other politicians that you admire?
Where do I get my policy ideas? Interesting. Obviously from Twitter, a lot of the things that I've done have come from my constituents. I mean, things that have been brought to me, that we've worked on in the neighborhoods I represent, have come a lot from individual constituents, from organized groups. We worked on these things together. In some cases, they've come from advocacy organizations where people have brought these to me. Bike Coalition, Walk SF. We've done things on transit, for example, or on traffic safety. So I tend to be open in that regard of for ideas that people have, and kind of keep my eye out in that way. I think that there are legislators certainly that I admire, where I could see, looking to them for some policy ideas. I'm very close with Ash Kalra, who's the chair of the Progressive Caucus, Buffy Wicks, who's the chair of the Housing Committee. You know, I think advocacy organizations are, you know, are also important in that regard. So, yeah, I listen to podcasts. I mentioned a podcast earlier as a reclined podcast. Unfortunately, you don't get that much time to do like normal people reading. I don't think I've read like a straight up regular book in a while because I just have to read so much for everything else. Yeah.
Well, since you mentioned street safety, that's actually something that has come up in the other candidate meet and greets. So, you know, I know that you've been in support of, you know, Car Free JFK, Market Street, protected bike lanes in Soma, and as you mentioned, the lowered speed limits in the Tenderloin. So what do you see as the next step for safer streets to help make streets safer for everyone and especially vulnerable road users? And how can the state legislature support us in this effort?
Well, you know, unfortunately, there aren't very many people who are advocating for street safety in that regard in the state legislature. And David Chu was certainly one of the few who was, and Scott Wiener as well, and Phil. So we have a good delegation on that front. And I would want to continue that. You know, there are some things that obviously we fell short on. Automated speed enforcement is something that I think, you know, we need to be doing, looking at more alternatives when it relates to traffic enforcement as well. You know, we were able to make some progress to allow for cities to reduce their speed limits. And so making sure that we continue policies like that. You know, there are certain things that we can do to make investments in infrastructure for biking and walking that the state could step into. Certainly there's a lot of money that's coming from the federal government. I'd like to see more of that go, less to build new roads and build out our car and automobile footprint and parking footprint, but rather look at alternatives. There's also a lot that we can do around the regulation of new types of transportation and technologies. I'd like to see us better facilitate and support things like, you know, e-bikes and rebates for e-bikes and transitioning people who are in the rideshare and delivery sectors to electric vehicles and for delivery e-bikes. And, you know, in addition to that, really putting more emphasis on those things in the way that we allow for technologies to grow. You know, we have the state sometimes get in our way when it comes to being able to do things. We, as I'm sure you all have heard, when we have tried to increase the cost of residential parking permits to be able to maybe fund some transportation projects, the state doesn't allow for that. So the state sometimes has a built-in investment or protection of car infrastructure and car owners over and above everything else. And I think that needs to shift if we're going to both do what we need to do for our environment and also improve traffic safety, street safety. So those are some of the things that I think that I would focus on. And part of it is just making sure that there's strong voices on those issues in Sacramento. There's very few people who prioritize those things. I don't own a car, and I think I haven't confirmed this, but I'm guessing I'd probably be the only one in the state legislature out of 120 who doesn't own a car. And so, you know, bringing that perspective of how we get around safely without vehicles, I think is very important.
We probably have time for maybe 2 more questions. So Ira asked a question in the chat, and this is about permanent supportive housing. What state laws would you propose so that cities like SF can't pass up opportunities to buy permanent supportive housing due to political meddling like we saw in Japantown earlier this year?
Well, you know, I think that there should be some set goals for certain levels of supportive housing that are needed in every city. So that's one, city and county. Right now, a lot of it is optional. Even when the state is willing to pay for it, a lot of places still say no thanks. We're learning some lessons around how we're approaching the RENA process, and I think there needs to be clearer standards. Even I think cities and counties should be able to be sued if they don't build their fair share or fulfill their collective responsibility to when it comes to supportive housing or other types of services for people who are currently or formerly homeless. I also don't think that, I do think it should be something that is, essentially by right, and that these should be able to be built, wherever they're needed. So, the situation as you described, that particular situation was a little different because it wasn't so much an approval that was needed, it was whether the state was going to purchase it. So I think, forcing the state to purchase a building is something that I think we could get to by requiring certain levels of these beds to be procured or built in each city and county. And not only do we have issues for individual neighborhoods, but we obviously also have cities and counties that entirely are opting out of these sort of housing options or facilities.
All right, so I guess we'll take the last question from Will. If you want to unmute.
Thank you. So this is a question about kind of where your positions have been over the past few years. When you were running for your current position, you said, this is a direct quote, "I'm not going to pick fights on the other side of the city." And I was happy to see that you recently did speak out boldly about the need to build the greatest number of units we possibly can of a 100% affordable housing project on Irving Street in the Sunset. That's the other side of the city. I'm wondering whether you see this as an evolution in the way you think about building more housing in San Francisco, and if so, what inspired it?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to do both. I mean, I ran for supervisor saying I was going to be laser focused on my district, and I have tried to do that in every way, including the small things. We have 200 and something trash cans now because I was focused on that. We have built a lot of housing here. We've done a lot of services here. We've, really, I've tried to be, as I said when I was running, focused on the needs of my district. I also will say that I did say, when I was running, that I thought we should build a lot more housing, including in other parts of the city, but also in my own district. So I didn't say that it wasn't important for us to build housing in other parts of the city. I also felt very strongly then that, and I said this repeatedly, that we do need to have every part of our city step up and provide for services. And that includes, one of the first things I really try to push for is getting every district to do a navigation center. Things that for me are consistent with my values in terms of what I'm saying now, focusing on the small things and the really day-to-day things that my constituents are experiencing here and being there for them, but also recognizing that this district and the neighborhoods in District 6 can't do it alone, and far too often they're being asked to do it on their own, or just in a very unsustainable way, such a disproportionate share of it. And I think that where I've gotten to the point where now I'm willing to pick fights on the other side of the city is I think that I really do feel that this is not something that one district or one neighborhood can do the responsibility to build housing, to provide for services, to provide for transportation. All of that is a collective responsibility that every neighborhood needs to be a part of, and every city and county needs to be a part of. So to the extent that that I didn't think that I was going to need to pick fights on the other side of the city in order to, really advocate for the people I represent and for a better city overall. It's an evolution. Yes, I was wrong. I do think that, especially as the supervisor of the district that I represent, I have to advocate for everyone to do their part and for us to build collectively a broader city and state that meets our needs. I will say I kind of see where I'm at right now as sort of the bottom of the river in some ways. It's the place where, when everybody is not doing their part, we're the ones who suffer the most from that. This is where people who are discarded, people who can't access housing or services, wherever they are, whatever neighborhood or city they're in, they end up in the Tenderloin in the South of Market. And I didn't fully acknowledge or understand the issue to be exactly in those terms, but I also acknowledge now, from 3 years of representing these neighborhoods, that we can't solve the problem here by only focusing here. We have to go up the river and build systems and structures and collective responsibility so that we take care of everybody and not discard them. And I think I'm I'm at a place to really understand that deeply as the representative of this area. So yes, I guess I would say it is an evolution. And if we don't have elected officials who are willing to learn and say when they've learned and say why they've learned, I think that we have a problem. And I think too often we have people in elected office who are just going to say they're going to defend whatever it was that they said before, no matter what has happened along the way. And I try to be reflective. I definitely have not always got it right. I try to learn from the people I represent and be humble about it, and do the right thing as things happen and as they come in front of me, and be transparent about that. But I do appreciate the question, and I do understand that the way I phrased it and thought about it has changed. And I think I recognize that I've learned that from working in this district. And this is a long rambling answer, but there's one more thing I want to say about this. I thought that when I was running in 2018, I hadn't yet been on the board of supervisors. I had been a school board member. I was convinced by the argument that I heard from a lot of folks that they thought that the best way for them to build more housing, of which I supported, and for them to upzone in their commercial corridors around the city, which I supported, was that they were going to come up with some sort of neighborhood process and come up with a way that they were going to do it and the right way to do that for themselves. Well, we're 3 years into, at least my experience on the board of supervisors, and none of that has happened. They have not come up with those community plans. They are not building housing. They are not building affordable housing. They are finding ways to say no at every single opportunity. So I'm not willing to wait any longer, particularly when my district is suffering so much from our collective failure to provide for all of our people and for our growth. So that has also changed, which is that I would have hoped for a lot more progress from other neighborhoods and cities and counties by now. But I do think that the total allegiance to local control on some of these issues has simply been a way for people to say no. And I can't accept that as the District 6 supervisor, and I wouldn't accept it as an assembly member.
All right, well, I think we're about out of time. Supervisor, do you have any Any final thoughts? Do you want to
I
tell
think that
folks?
was also serving as my final thoughts.
Do you want to tell folks how to find out more about your campaign?
Sure. Well, seeing the people who are left here, I think you all follow me on Twitter, so I'll see you on there. And you know, drop me a line if you want to talk further. Matt Haney SF at Gmail, or send me a DM, and I'm happy to have an individual conversation with any of you. I'm always happy to learn and be self-reflective and tell you what I think from what I've seen. And you know, I look forward to working together. I hope to be your assembly member, and I hope to be someone who advocates for all of us, and who's inclusive and a problem solver, and helps to build an urban environment that is better to meet the needs of everyone, for people's human dignity, for their affordability, and for the quality of life, and also for the very serious threats that we have as relates to climate change and wildfires and all of the things that I think are really serious existential threats. You know, I appreciate your advocacy, and even when we don't agree on things, you know, I appreciate the dialogue and am open to learning, and I hope that the consequence of this is that we have better outcomes for all of us.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time, and thank you everyone else for joining. We'll be posting this event on YouTube soon and sending it out. Stay tuned for more events after the new year. And if you are not yet a member of Urban Environmentalists, please consider joining to help us make events like this possible.
Great.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you. Appreciate it.